Good morning. It's great to be here. My first trip to Sydney. I've been very impressed so far. I'm using it as a scouting trip for my family to come back hopefully sometime soon. So that was a great intro, and some of the presentations earlier this morning were a great intro to what I want to talk about, and that is about how do you provide a better customer experience. They said I was responsible for customer analytics. What it's really responsible for is our client-side products, so browser, mobile, and synthetics. And I just want to point out, I have not met Paul Keene. I did not pay him to say, love your synthetics, even though you absolutely should, and we'll talk about that more. So before I get started, the lawyers always want us to show this. Don't use anything I say to make investment decisions, yada, yada, yada. You've seen it. I've fulfilled my obligation there. Okay, just quickly, here's a quick peek of what I'm going to talk about this morning. And really what I want to talk about is exactly what they were just talking about in the MLBAM example, which is it's not just about everything that's happening on the back end or on your infrastructure, but it's actually about how are you providing a better customer experience and how are you actually monitoring it to see what the actual customer experience is. We'll have some use cases to talk through as well. Okay, so a quick explanation. What we have here is a bunch of customers using an interface to access an application running on some infrastructure, right? So when we talk about customer experience monitoring, what we're really talking about is understanding what it's like for your users to interact with your site. Basically, is my site up? Is it acting the way I expect it to? And is it performant? The cool thing is that we can monitor this directly. Now, back in the day, a long time ago, we only had proxies for what a customer experience was. Early monitoring focused on infrastructure, in large part because that's what people had figured out how to monitor. Unfortunately, there's a lot that can go wrong, even if your systems are working. Now, eventually, some folks, like Lou, they started monitoring the application layer. So this was a step in the right direction, but it was still just a proxy for what most people really care about, which is whether or not their customers can use their application successfully. Oh, more losing customers, not good. Okay, so which brings us to modern tools that allow us to monitor our customer experience directly. And this is awesome, right? We can monitor what we actually care about instead of trying to guess what our customers are experiencing based on what's happening further down the stack. Because here's the thing. If your customers are able to do what they want to do on your site, and, of course, what you want them to do, then the rest is all kind of academic, right? Yes, you should keep your infrastructure running. You should make sure that your application is running. But if your customers are successful, that's what really drives your business, which means you should be monitoring that. This kind of front-end monitoring has always been important, but modern architectures mean that it's more important now than ever before. Okay, let's take a look at why that is. Now, this iceberg is your application. Well, at least until climate change melts it. But in the early days of the web, most of the application work took place on the back end. The front end was a relatively thin, dumb client. But along came more modern technologies, like Angular and React, and they take on a lot more of what used to be done by the back end. So now, your application looks more like this, with a lot more of the performance resulting from client-side technologies than ever before. Let's look at it another way. So this graph comes from an actual site that's being monitored by New Relic with New Relic Browser. Take a look at the load time associated with this graph. So, what do you notice? 7 to 8 seconds, right? That's pretty large. That's a pretty long time to ask a user to wait for their content to load. You're definitely going to want to optimize this. Now, let's look at how that's divided between front end and back end. Right, so the back end time here associated with this page load is less than half a second. Right, so if you were only monitoring that front end or that back end, you'd assume that your customer experience is pretty good. All right, now, here's the thing. It's kind of common knowledge that for any site that has a load time of 3 seconds or more has about a 40% abandonment rate. And every additional second of load time adds about 7% more to that abandonment rate. So if the user of this site was only monitoring his back end, not his front end, didn't realize that it was taking 7 to 8 seconds for the customer to see the loading of the content, he could have a 68% abandonment rate. 2/3 of his customers could leave before they even see what they're trying to see. So we suggest one way to improve this is to combine browser and synthetics. We affectionately call it browsing. So now, I think most of you know about New Relic, browser and synthetics, and I don't want to talk about either one of them individually. I want to talk about how we use them today, how you can use them together to improve the performance of your site. So basically, here's the difference, and it was kind of talked about this morning. At the end of the day, browser is looking at real user data, real user monitoring. Synthetics is very much a synthetic check. It is just basically doing an ongoing robotic-style check of your site to see if it's up, if it is doing what you think it's going to do, and if it's performant. One way to look at that is to think about it as reactive versus proactive. Don't let the typical emphasis on proactivity as a buzzword sway you here. Both proactive and reactive monitoring are essential to understanding a customer experience. Now, proactive monitoring gives you feedback that doesn't necessarily or doesn't require actual traffic to your site. That's important because it brings reliability to your monitoring. You can still generate data even at times when nobody is visiting your site and on pages that maybe don't get a lot of traffic but are really important to your business when they do. This sets basically a baseline for you, and it puts you into the driver's seat of determining what is monitored and when. Now, reactive monitoring, on the other hand, relies on actual users engaging with your site. So it might be less reliable, but it's the thing you care about most, your actual users. The other thing that's really essential about reactive monitoring is that, users don't necessarily act the way you expect them to act. You may have an assumption of what they're going to do, but in reality, they may do something completely different. And that can show you other parts or other ways, other paths you may need to be monitoring. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of locals here. If I went around the room and asked, how do I get from here at the ICC over to the Opera House? I'd get a lot of different views you'd tell me a lot of different ways to get there. But in reality, there probably is a single optimal path. You can look at it like that. Browser is telling you all the actual ways all of you differently would go from here to the Opera House, whereas synthetics is going to reliably do the same thing every time. Now, let's look at it another way. You can think of synthetics as the lab, right? It's all about minimizing variables, right? So we use the same locations, devices, browsers every time, so we're generating clean and reliable data. A baseline. So if something changes in the baseline, it's most likely something in your control, like a deployment or a CDN issue. You're never going to see a slow load time just because someone is using an old phone while walking into the subway. Browser, on the other hand, is more like the jungle, right? You get all the empirical data about what's actually happening out there. Every combination of variables, location, devices, browsers, network speeds, geographies, etc. So this is what's really going on with your users, and it will show every combination and every edge case that's possible to affect performance. However, without having a clean baseline to compare this data to, it's hard to figure out what the root cause of an anomaly might be. As a side note, it turns out that combining these two tools is much more cost-effective than trying to monitor everything and give more complete understanding of a front-end performance than just using real user data from browser alone. Now, because of how they work, it turns out that these tools are good at catching different kinds of errors. Let's look at a couple of examples. Okay, so imagine you have a JavaScript that works fine most of the time, but because of variance in how different browsers execute JavaScript, it can create a race condition that results in intermittent failure, but only in Safari. Now, as we talked about, to keep the variables low, Synthetics only runs on Chrome. So it's never going to catch that issue with the JavaScript running in Safari. However, Browser will catch it because Browser is capturing every combination of variables that users are bringing to the site, including every different browser that customers are using. Now, there's some implications here, right? People that were trying to access your site with Safari, if you were only monitoring it with Synthetics, you wouldn't realize that they weren't being successful. And also, we'd pay some opportunity cost. This can be a very difficult type of error to find. And if you're spending time doing that, your engineering team is doing that instead of doing things to improve your website and improve your business. Let's look at another example. So, assume you're an e-commerce company and you've just deployed your new UI. Now, unfortunately, didn't mean to, but one of your engineers accidentally broke the JavaScript binding responsible for adding an item to cart. So, when somebody clicks the Add to Cart button, this JavaScript binding is supposed to actually have the item added to the cart, but they broke that. Now, Browser is never going to catch that, because since the JS binding is broken, it sees that Add to Cart button as just another image on the site, and it doesn't know when somebody's clicking it and nothing's happening, it won't throw an error because it doesn't realize that that's not working the way it's supposed to. Synthetics, however, since you can run scripted checks, will actually run through. It'll say, hey, wait a minute, somebody tried to click Add to Cart and nothing happened. So this is really a big implication, right? If that Add to Cart button is broken and you're not getting any errors and nobody's able to add to cart, you're not making any revenue whatsoever. Okay, I don't expect you to take my word for it, though. All right, let's talk about an actual customer example of how Browser and Synthetics can be used together. I'm sure many of you know Red Hat. They're a customer, and actually one of their employees, Jared Sprague, was at FutureStack New York and talked about this. So I unabashedly stole this from him to bring here to Sydney. So this is a pretty kind of high-level view of their monitoring setup. So you'll notice that on their internal side, they have their development, QA, staging, and production servers. They've got APM running on all of those. And they've got Synthetics monitors on private locations at the origin, monitoring all of those all the time. Now they also have, of course, the data goes out through the CDN, out to the user side, and they've got a lot of public locations around the world that are synthetically monitoring those sites, as well as, of course, they're getting real user data with Browser. Now, here's a really interesting example of how they've used the two together. They started noticing that out in the field, in the users, with Browser, they were seeing certain locations had a spike in errors. At the same time, they noticed from Synthetics that there were some errors happening out in the geos, in the public locations, but in the private locations, at the origin, nothing was going wrong. So what this did is it pointed to them, since at the origin, everything worked fine. In the field, only certain geos, and the same geos were not working as well, both synthetically and with real user data from Browser. So they noticed, maybe there's something wrong with the file in the CDN cache. What they figured out was that a JavaScript file that had been uploaded had about 100 lines of JavaScript truncated for some reason, and so the site wasn't working. All right, so they never would have captured this without having both of these synthetics in place. So they wouldn't have captured it as quickly. They wouldn't have noticed it as quickly, at least. Okay, so as I mentioned, Jared talked about this at FutureStack New York, and for time I cut some stuff out, but on our YouTube channel, if you want to go see more actual use cases from a customer, feel free to go look. I don't expect you to write that down. I think you can go to YouTube and search a new Relic, and you'll see this later anyway. So, okay. So what does all that mean? So we affectionately, like I said, we call this browsing. But last month, we introduced a feature called comparative charting to bring these two products together. So what that means is if you are monitoring the same URL or page with both browser and synthetics, now in each of those products, you'll see a drop-down that brings the data from the other product in. So if you're here, on the left here is browser, on the bottom you see the actual page load time, and it says, hey, average load times in synthetic monitors are 27% faster, right? And the corresponding side in synthetics, it's showing you the real user data is actually 27% slower. So it's one, you can see them one on top of the other. So this is cool because it allows you to quickly, to quickly see not only the difference between your ideal case performance and your real-world performance, but can also help you point you in the right direction about likely causes for performance issues, whether or not you see them in both data sets. So for example, if you see a jump in both graphs at the same time, then you likely have a CDN issue or unoptimized assets or something like that, a bad deploy, for example. On the other hand, if you see an issue in browser but not in synthetics, this might point to a compatibility issue, maybe with a browser or a device. So this is just a first step in this direction that we've implemented and that we hope you'll find a lot of benefit from, and we'll continue to build on this capability of bringing these two products together over time. So that's what I had to say today, just to talk to you about how you can use these products to measure both your real-world, real user data and your kind of ideal case, and use it together to find those issues faster and more reliably. Thanks a lot, and I'm going to hand it over to Lee now.